During World War II, the Imperial Japanese Army had a staunch enemy, and unlike the Allies, this opponent spoke the same language and breathed the same air, the Imperial Japanese Navy. This was one of the worst cases of clashes between compatriot forces in modern history. In this new installment, we want to go through the history of betrayals, attacks and conspiracies between the two main military forces of Japan. Why did they hate each other? What effect did this have on World War II? Join us to discover the answers to these questions. Japan's transformation from feudal island to modern military power was swift and dramatic. Its major victory over Russia in the Russo-Japanese War at the turn of the 20th century left the Imperial Japanese Navy as the largest naval power in the region. At the same time, the Army's campaign was also historic and shocking. Both forces knew that they would be crucial for the small island to compete in a world full of threats. Military forces can often rely on local industry to nurture their ranks. The problem is that Japan did not have the territory or the raw material to support two forces with the intention of being the most powerful institution in the country. One of the two had to yield to the other. In any normal country, these kinds of dangerous differences between forces are resolved by the government, but in the case of Japan, the government had its own economic concerns. Prior to World War II, the Japanese economy was supported by the zaibatsus, powerful family conglomerates that even had their own banks, which is how titans of Japanese industry such as Nissan or Mitsubishi operated at that time. These economic fronts were private, but they had a decisive influence on public life. To further complicate the situation, there were 4 large zaibatsus in Japan, 2 allied with the Navy and 2 allied with the Army. In addition, each force and conglomerate was represented by a Japanese cabinet minister, who advocated for laws that benefited those they represented. This meant constant political bidding to approve or veto legislation concerning the production of weapons. All these details were ideal ingredients for a political and military crisis. Of course, being military institutions that defended the same emperor and the same territory, they had common goals. Both the Navy and the Army knew that it was essential for Japan to secure new territories and resources to sustain the island's thriving industry. One might suppose that this shared goal was reason enough to put aside their differences and collaborate for the benefit of their nation, but things are never that simple. In the 1930s, the Imperial Japanese Navy had a vision of southward expansion, which involved dominating former European colonies in Asia, such as Java, in order to exploit their resources. In that case, the biggest obstacle to achieving these conquests would be the United States, which also sought to have a presence in the region to exploit local resources. On the side of the Imperial Japanese Army, their strategy was somewhat more complex, but also more interesting. The institution proposed to take advantage of the tensions between China and Russia to invade Manchuria and Siberia. In that case, the main enemy for conquest would be the Chinese Army and the Red Army of the Soviet Union. But while the forces were deciding which way to go, the Japanese economy suffered the consequences of the Great Depression that broke out in the late 1920s. Gradually, the democratic government of Japan began to be increasingly influenced by the commanders of the army, who recommended right-wing conservative policies. In 1930, Japan ratified the London Naval Treaty, which limited the number of ships the Japanese island could possess. This infuriated all the officers of the Imperial Japanese Navy, who, after their huge victory against Russia, expected to play a more decisive role in the country's political, economic and military decision-making. In November of that same year, a far-right group aligned with the Navy assassinated the Prime Minister of Japan. The army responded with 2 coup attempts carried out during 1931. Their plan was to incite riots so that the government would institute martial law. In this context, they launched a final attack to seize power. Unfortunately for the conspirators, their intentions were discovered by Japan's secret police. The army had to secure their fortress somehow, so they decided to invade Manchuria without government authorization. This is how they established a military colony run by the institution. The Navy felt at a disadvantage, so on May 15, 1932, 11 officers assassinated the new Prime Minister and assaulted the homes of politicians who collaborated with the Army. The tensions continued on a minor plane until 1936, when the Army launched a new coup attempt, and this time they had practically the complete collaboration of all the regiments. They again attempted to assassinate the Prime Minister, a position that at this point was unbelievable that anyone would want to fill. When the Navy found out about this attack, they garrisoned and threatened to launch a massive attack on the Army positions. When the officers were loading the ammunition, the Emperor himself had to intervene to prevent the conflict from sending the island to the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. Between the failed coups and the invasion of Manchuria, the Army's reputation was in tatters. This allowed the Navy to establish political control of the country. By 1937, on the eve of World War II, Japan was led by admirals and democracy had given way to a military regime. The force's 15 minutes of fame came on December 7, 1941, with the attack on Pearl Harbor, which prompted the entry of the United States into the world conflict. The Imperial Navy and Imperial Army hated each other, but they knew there was no chance of winning the war if they didn't cooperate. To simplify this grudging cooperation, the Army made all the decisions concerning land missions, and the Navy made marine missions. Each branch had its own Air Force, airborne soldiers, and aid personnel. And we assure you that they were strict with the limitations of each force. If an Army aircraft landed on a Navy ship or base, the unit would not be repaired by Navy workers. The plane would have to wait for Army mechanics. Likewise, if Army intelligence was intercepting information about marine attacks, providing that information to the Navy was not among their priorities. It was pretty much a children's game carried out by adults with military charges. The best example of this operational failure is found in the very low number of bombers destroyed by Japan. According to the Army, the bombers came flying over the ocean, so they were a problem for the Navy. For its part, the Navy claimed that the bombers were attacking ground targets and were therefore the Army's problem. This is how numerous American bombers managed to destroy strategic positions without major problems. Only 74 of those aircraft were intercepted by Japanese fighters. Instead, more than 1,000 were destroyed by German air defenses, which did cooperate to protect themselves from powerful American bombers. As we can see, this strategy is not useful at all if you are facing a group of well-armed and prepared allies. Cooperation between the forces was poor and triggered numerous crises within Japan. Defeats in the Pacific began to accumulate, and stories of famine or low military supplies for one force or another ended up affecting the island's performance in the war. Considering the incarnate hatred that existed between the forces, it is surprising that the island was the last Axis country to surrender. Defeat in U.S. intervention smoothed out many of the rough edges, but the rivalry between the Navy and the Army shaped Japanese history in the first half of the 20th century. This is how we come to the end of the video. We hope that you liked discovering these facts from the past as much as we did. Until the next video of military history.